All right. Welcome to Illuminist History. In previous classes, we discussed the original Greco-Egyptian Hermeticism, a complex phenomenon originating in the area around Alexandria in Roman-occupied Egypt, probably in the 1st to 2nd centuries CE, or Common Era. And unless I say otherwise, all of the dates are going to be Common Era. And we've also discussed aspects of esotericism that arose in the wake of the advent of Islam in the 7th century, specifically Islamic Neoplatonism and Sufism. And all this sets the stage for tonight's topic, Arabic Hermeticism, which to a large extent shaped the Hermetic revival of the European Renaissance and thereafter. My principal source for this talk is the terrific book, The Arabic Hermes, by Kevin van Bladel. Now, this is an academic work that emphasizes that there is no evidence for an Arabic Hermeticism as such, by which he means an ongoing Arabic community of belief or practice that prioritizes teachings attributed to Hermes. No Arabic community, in other words, that corresponds to the Alexandrian milieu of the original Greek Hermetica. But as Illuminists, as Hermeticists, we have the intention to work within the Hermetic tradition. And so the field will seem different to us than to an academic who is concerned above all with limiting his assertions to those that can withstand academic critique. So for instance, if there is an Arabic community that practices alchemy, astrology, and/or magic, and they include Hermes among their authorities, for us, that qualifies as an Arabic Hermeticism. And as we will see, there were several of those. But the primary thrust of Van Bladel's book is still suitable for our purposes, namely to investigate what is known about Hermes and his myth in Arabic. And the place to begin is not in the Arabic-speaking world, but rather Persia. We recall that after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, the lands he had conquered were divided among his generals. The Seleucid Empire, named after Alexander's former general Seleucus, occupied most of Persia and Babylonia up until the Parthian era, originating in the northeast of Persia, which seized control of the area in the 2nd century BC. In the 3rd century Common Era, the Parthians were overthrown in turn by the Sassanids, a dynasty originating in southwestern Persia. This is the era that is of interest to us. Sassanid Persia, in which the language was Middle Persian before their conquest by the Arabs, after which Arabic became the official language and Middle Persian was preserved mostly by the Zoroastrian priesthood. The earliest evidence of the name Hermes in Middle Persian comes from several Mesopotamian magic bowls and an amulet. The magic bowl shown here includes the text, "I am clad with the garment of Hermes, Dabia, and the Word, and my strength is in him who created heaven and earth." Other examples from magic bowls include, "I, in the name of Gabriel and Michael and Raphael, and in the name of the angel Asiel and Hermes, the great Lord." And another that says, "Yophiel thy name, Yehiel they call thee, Sasangiel Yahweh, and so names Hermes Metatron Yah, in the name of Tigin, Trigis, Balbis, Sabgas, Sadrapas. These are the angels who bring salvation to all the children of men." We can see the similarity here to spells found in the Greek magical papyri, and also the curious association of Hermes with angels, which is something that we'll return to later. After that, we can see that a specifically Hermetic literature developed in Middle Persian, namely astrological texts attributed to Hermes. There's a 13th century Latin work on the fixed stars called Liber de Stylis Baebianis, or Baebenis, which is translated from the Arabic Kitab Asra al-Nugum, the secret of stars, said to be authored by Hermes. And I should say right now that I am not an Arabic speaker, so prepare for all the Arabic names and words to be terribly mispronounced. But the internal evidence demonstrates that this was originally a Middle Persian work. Another has the catchy title, The Book of Hermes on Revolutions of the Years of the Nativities, as Umar ibn al-Faruhan al-Tavari translated it from the Persian into Arabic, it being the rod of gold. Bestseller material right there. It says so right in the title, but there is other reason to believe that this work is genuinely from Persia, internal to the text. And then there's the Carmen Astrologicum of Dorotheus, the original mostly lost in Greek, but it survives in an Arabic translation from the Middle Persian by the same Omar ibn al-Faruhan as the previous text. It refers to Hermes Trismegistus, a king of Egypt, and is addressed to a Babylonian Hermes, the son of Dorotheus, king of Egypt. And other Persian astrologers writing in Arabic cite Hermes as an authority. So it's plain that Hermes was recognized by the Sassanids as an authority on astrology, and that there was a Middle Persian Hermetic corpus of some kind. There is some evidence to support the legend that a large-scale effort to translate Greek texts into Middle Persian occurred during the reign of Sapor I, pictured here, the second of the Sassanid emperors. It is possible, but not proven, that some Greek Hermetica could have passed into Persian at that time. You might recall from an earlier class, the House of Wisdom, the great center of learning in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate. It was designed by a famed Persian named Naubakht. His son, al-Fadi ibn Nubakt, wrote an account, according to the Fihrist, that Dahak, the demonic ruler for 1,000 years in Iranian mythology, gathered scholars in Babylon in 12 citadels corresponding to the signs of the zodiac. These scholars ruled the people before the rise of a prophet whose name isn't specified. Once the people no longer believed them, the scholars dispersed. One of the greatest of these scholars was named Hermes, who then became king of Egypt and shared his learning with the people there. And later, Alexander the Macedonian, in this story, conquered Persia and destroyed all the learned texts except for a few that he had translated into Greek and Egyptian, while some of the ancient learning survived in India and China. And then Persia and Babylon fell into ignorance until Ardashir, the founder of the Sassanid dynasty, began to reassemble the lost learning. His son, Sapor I, continued the effort, including translating the works of Hermes the Babylonian, who had been king over Egypt. There are many Arabic and Persian accounts of parts of this narrative, but only Ibn Naubakht's version includes Hermes. It seems clear that these stories allowed the Persians to regard astrology as originating with them rather than it being imported. It has not yet been proven that the translations of Greek Hermetica into Persian are as old as the time of Sapor I. If it were, it would be an important testament in the history of the Hermetica. Otherwise, the Persian Hermetica would most likely have come through Christian editors, the same as the Hermetica already known to us. You might recall Mani, the founder of Manichaeism. He was an associate of Sapor I. He dedicated a work to him and accompanied him on a campaign against Rome. And incidentally, this was 15 years after an earlier conflict between Sapor and Rome, in which Plotinus fought. Mani emphasized a list of forebears who had espoused the teachings of Manichaeism before him, so he said, and among them was the prophet Enoch. A century later, the Syrian poet Ephraim, who lived on the Roman side of the Persian-Roman frontier, claimed that the Manichaeans regarded Hermes as one of the earlier teachings of Mani's message. It is not impossible that the Manichaeans regarded Enoch and Hermes as the same person, just as Muslims were to do later. Also, some scholars think that a passage from the Hymn of the Pearl that we've covered earlier a passage from the Hymn of the Pearl that refers to Parthia might also connect to legends of Persian knowledge lost in Egypt and recovered. The Hymn of the Pearl says, "All this that now was befalling, my parents perceived and were anxious. It was then proclaimed in our kingdom that all should speed to our gate, kings and chieftains of Parthia, and of the east all the princes. And this is the counsel they came to. I should not be left down in Egypt." So we think of it on the level of the soul, about the losing the pearl and the recovery of it, kind of the hero's journey. But scholars do think that on another level, it may refer to that ongoing myth of Persian knowledge lost in Egypt and recovered. Lastly, there's evidence surrounding the legend of a Persian magus who the Greeks knew as Osthenes. This here is a picture of some Persian magus. I couldn't find any images of Osthenes whatsoever. A Syriac text has been discovered containing the lost works of the alchemist Zosimus, and a work purporting to be a correspondence between a learned Egyptian and a learned Persian. The Egyptian philosopher Pebecius tells the Persian mage Osran that he has found the divine books of Osthenes written in Persian letters, so could he please supply the Persian alphabet for his studies? And Osran sends the requested Persian letters, and then Pebecius writes back that these works include the wisdom of all the sciences. In them, the disciples of Osthenes explained that the writings on the 7 holy tablets of Hermes had been hidden by a king behind 7 doors. There are descriptions of a dragon eating its tail and other symbolic figures, and then someone ordering them not to open the doors for anybody unworthy. The gist of this text seems to be that the ancient wisdom of Hermes, recovered and taught by the Persian Osthenes in Egypt, is, through this dialogue, restored to the Magi. It is possible that this text is contemporary with Zosimos, late 3rd, early 4th century, as the texts are bound together, and Zosimos cites a Pebecius at one point. The story of Osthenes was written of, or possibly created, by Bolus of Mendes, a Hellenized Egyptian, and this picture is supposed to be a picture of a Hellenized Egyptian. There are no images of Bolus of Mendes that I could find either. This is in the 2nd century BC. His Physica Kai Mystica apparently depicts Persian wisdom found in Egypt being returned to Persia. I don't have a copy of this, so I can't confirm that, but this is what I'm told. There is an Arabic manuscript containing an account of Osthenes dreaming of 7 doors, behind which are the 7 treasure houses of the sciences. He needs the key, which must be obtained from an elephant, dragon, vulture, or a boros. And so he does get that key. The first tablet is in Egyptian, the second, Persian, the third, Sanskrit, and the rest are too damaged to read. The Persian tablet says that all lands, including Egypt, need the Persian wisdom, and repeats the Pebecius or Osran story, without mentioning Hermes, but the story goes on to say how Osthenes followed a guide and completed the work as Hermes described, so probably Hermes was the guide in this account. As we've seen, the legend of Osthenes as a revealer of Hermetic wisdom in Egypt was known in the 3rd century, and teachings of Osthenes were transmitted in the Sasanian Empire, but at an unknown time. So the reputation of Hermes and possibly his works might have been transmitted in Persia because of the legend of the Persian Osthenes. A second tradition about Hermes as a teacher of astrology comes from the ancient city of Haran, on the southeast border of modern-day Turkey. Haran is famous as the last outpost of pagan religion after its ban in the Roman Empire, and even after Haran's conquest by Muslims. In later centuries, Haran declared Hermes as its prophet. But it is difficult to prove the course of Hermeticism in Haran, And although Haran is widely assumed to be a channel for Hermeticism into the Arab world, no particular Hermetic text can be proved to be Haranian in origin or transmission. But we'll look at what evidence there is. At a certain point, the religion of the Haranians became known to the Arabic-speaking world as Sabian. This word Sabian is originally found in the Quran in passages such as Surah 5:69. Truly those who believe, and those who are Jews, and the Sabians, and the Christians, whosoever believes in God and the last day, and works righteousness, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. So the Sabians are held to be one of the people of the book, who are held to be blameless in their choice of religion. And yet, there's no record of any agreement on exactly what the Quran means by Sabian. The Haranians succeeded in having their religion recognized as the Sabians of the Quran, thus evading persecution. But so also did the Mandeans of southern Iraq. Eventually, Sabian came to mean simply pagan. So exactly what is meant by Sabian has to be examined in its historical context. A late 6th or early 7th century Syriac anti-pagan Christian polemic called Prophecies of the Pagan Philosophers argues that the Haranians ought to convert to Christianity because of what the pagan sages taught, and includes passages supposedly from Hermes that are also found in the Tübingen Theosophy, which is a Christian compilation of supposed pagan testimonies to Christian doctrine. It also has a passage from the sage Poimandres that's from Corpus Hermetica 13. For one thing, this is interesting because it shows that something like our Corpus Hermetica that includes Treatise 13 and also probably began with Poimandres was known by the 7th century. But also, this suggests that Haranians at that time were thought to be pagan by Christians, and that they at least would have recognized Hermes as one among their many sages. In the early 9th century, Theodore Abu Kura, and that is supposed to be a portrait of him, who had been bishop of Haran, described the religion of the pagans as worship of the 7 planets and the 12 zodiacal houses. He also said that their prophet is Hermes. Since he had been bishop of Haran, and this description matches what is later said about the religion of Haran, it is very likely that by pagans, he means the pagans of Haran. There is evidence that al-Kindi, in the mid-9th century, only about a generation after the Haranians are said to have adopted the name Sabian, described the religion of the Haranian Chaldeans known as Sabians, or paganism. It is characterized as a kind of Aristotelianism mixed with astrology, both subjects of great interest to Muslim intellectuals at that time. And it's described as quite similar to Islam. They pray for a fixed number of times in a given direction at specific times of the day. They have a fast of 30 days with a feast at the end. They wash themselves after ritual pollution. Most likely, the Haranian pagans either developed practices like that to get along with their Muslim occupiers, or they at least claimed to practice that way. Hermes was said to be one of their luminaries, one of several, and so was Agathodaimon. Al-Kindi said that he had examined a book that the Haranians regarded as authoritative called Chapters of Hermes on the Doctrine of God's Unity. This could have been a part or all of the Corpus Hermetica, or at least was something like it, and would have been in Arabic, as al-Kindi could read no other language. Ibn al-Kifti, and this is a page from a work of Ibn al-Kifti, since there aren't any portraits of him. Ibn al-Kifti in the mid-13th century described texts like the Corpus Hermetica having been translated into Arabic, saying, "They are part of his chapters to his disciple Tati, by way of question and answer between the two." Now, Tat is known from several of the tracts in the Corpus Hermetica, so this would be an apt description. Sometime later in the same century, Ibn al-Ibri copied this earlier passage, saying that the manuscript is extant with us in Syriac. and since Syriac would have been the language of the Haranians, it is possible that this manuscript might have been of Haranian origin, but there's no way to know for sure. The Haranian Tabit ibn Qura, who died around 901, migrated to Baghdad and became an eminent mathematician and translator of Greek and Syriac works into Arabic, and wrote several works about the religion of his people. His descendants in Baghdad were prominent in the caliph's court and kept up awareness there of an ancient pre-Christian religion that wasn't entirely negative. In particular, his son, Sinan ibn Tabit, who died around 942, translated from Syriac into Arabic the laws of Hermes and his prayers that the pagans use in prayer. This may originally have been a traditional Hermetic text or a work of Tabit ibn Qura or Sinan himself. Al-Mubassir ibn Fatik, who we'll examine more closely shortly, gave an account of the religion of Hermes similar to al-Kindi and may have been influenced by this work, The Laws of Hermes. Al-Masudi, who died around 956, is known to have visited Haran personally, and this is his well-known account. This community, known as the Haranians and the Sabians, has, or consists of, philosophers. However, they are some of the common riffraff of the philosophers, differing from their elite sages in their doctrines. I consider them philosophers only by way of lineage, not by way of wisdom, because they are all Hellenes. Not all of the Hellenes are philosophers, only their sages are the philosophers. I saw on the door knocker of the gathering place of the Sabians in Haran a saying of Plato written in Syriac, of which Malik ibn Uqban and others of them informed me the interpretation. It is, "He who knows his essence becomes divine." Now, one possible source for this quote in Plato is the dialogue Alcibiades. And of course, it has a resonance with the famous inscription at Delphi, "Know thyself." This passage is sometimes used as evidence for a Platonic academy in Haran, but in the absence of other evidence, it's a bit of a stretch. Al-Masudi was one of the earliest to use the term Sabian to mean pagans of all kinds. He said that the Haranians are descendants of the Egyptian Sabians, who do not eat the same foods as the ancient Greeks. They abstain from fava beans, among other things, which suggests a Pythagorean connection. This distinction between Greek and Egyptian Sabians probably comes from the Arabic reception of Porphyry's letter to Anibo and Iamblichus's On the Mysteries, which were well known by that time. Possibly the most interesting, if still circumstantial, evidence comes from the compilation of Arabic occultism known as the Gayat al-Hakim, or Goal of the Wise, translated into Latin as the Picatrix, one of the oldest and most notorious grimoires. Some have said that it was what H.P. Lovecraft had in mind when he devised the Necronomicon. It draws on many sources, Arabic, Greek, Persian, Indian, but one section in particular, A Guide to Planetary Magic, claims to be derived from the Sabians and includes details about Haran. Unfortunately, a close study of the text shows that the part that refers to the Sabians and the part that refers to Haran come from separate sources, so we can't be sure whether these really are Haranian Sabian practices or Sabian practices from elsewhere that have a Haranian conclusion tacked onto them. Another notable thing about this section is that it includes passages from at least two of what are known as the talismanic Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. Let me say that again. The talismanic Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. A little digression here. Medieval culture, both European and Middle Eastern, placed great emphasis on the story that Socrates was the teacher of Plato, Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great proceeded to conquer what was thought of as the known world. You know, that's one powerful lineage, right? After that, the gist of the story varies depending on where you were. In Western Europe, Alexander's empire was eventually succeeded by Rome, and then Rome fell, so it was a story of days gone by. For the Arabic world, Rome was a temporary annoyance that they overcame, and the caliphate embodied the living legacy of Alexander's empire. By the 10th century, there were a number of Arabic texts claiming to be teachings that Aristotle bestowed upon Alexander. And the picture here is a Persian rendering of Alexander. In at least several of these texts, what Aristotle is bestowing to Alexander are the teachings of Hermes, involving magic, astrology, and alchemy. Most of these have yet to be translated into English, which just drives me crazy. But a couple of them, al-Ustuwatas and al-Istamachis, have passages inserted into that planetary magic treatise in the Gayat al-Hakim, attributed to the Sabians. If only we could rely on the sources for this treatise all being from the same place, that would at last provide us with the evidence that the Sabians of Haran possessed a body of Hermetic texts of their own, that there really was an Arabic Hermeticism in Haran. And maybe there it was, but we still haven't proved it. We'll come back to the Gayat al-Hakim and the talismanic Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica later. The Sabians in Haran came to a gradual end. There is evidence of some friction with their Muslim neighbors, particularly an edict to respect their rights as people of the book, implying that their rights were being disrespected. The last adherent of the Haranian Sabian religion on record was Hilal ibn al-Muhassin, who died in 1055, the great-great-great-grandson of Tabat ibn Qura, who converted to Islam on the guidance of a dream in 1012. Over the course of the 11th century, it seems that the Haranian Sabians converted to Islam, not in response to religious intolerance, but for safety in the face of political instability. In pre-modern Arabic scholarship before the modern era, there were three Hermeses. The first lived before the time of the Great Flood and was the founder of all the sciences. The second was a Babylonian who lived after the flood. And the third was an Egyptian. In medieval times, the emphasis was placed on the first Hermes, who received revelations from God and preserved them through inscriptions that he left in Egypt. This three Hermes model filtered into Europe and set the stage for Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermetica in the Renaissance. The earliest account of the three Hermeses comes from Abu Masar's Book of the Thousands. And strangely, this actually is an image of Abu Masar. He was a big enough deal to have portraiture done of him. And I will read this out because it's of great importance to the subsequent history. Abu Masar al-Balhi, the astrologer, said in the Book of the Thousands, "The Hermeses are three. The first of them is Hermes who was before the flood. The significance of Hermes is a title, like saying Caesar and Husra, which are titles. The Persians named him Wiwangan, meaning the just, in their biographies of the kings. He is the one to whose philosophy the Haranians adhere. The Persians state that his grandfather was Gayumart, that is, Adam. The Hebrews state that he is Enoch, which in Arabic is Idris." Abu Masar said, "He was the first to discuss the celestial phenomena of the movements of the stars, and his grandfather Gayumart taught him the hours of the Nikthemeron, or 24-hour period. He is the first who built temples and glorified God in them. He was the first to investigate medicine and to discuss it. He composed for his contemporaries odes in poetic meter and well-known verses on terrestrial and celestial things. He was the first to give advanced warning of the flood, and he thought that a celestial catastrophe of fire or water would overwhelm the earth. His home was Upper Egypt. He chose that place and built the pyramids and cities of clay there. He feared that knowledge would pass away in the flood, so he built the monumental temples. It is a mountain known as Birba in Akhmim. which he chiseled out, portraying it in carvings all the arts and their uses, and pictures of all the instruments of the artisans, indicating the features of the sciences by illustrations, out of desire thereby to preserve the sciences forever for those after him, fearing that all trace of it would perish from the world. It is reported by the account transmitted from the early Muslims that Idris was the first to study books, to investigate the sciences. God sent 30 scrolls down to him. He was the first to sew clothing and to wear it. God raised him to a high place. al-Mubassir told some absurd reports about him, of which I related the most true and most likely. Success is in God the Exalted. The second Hermes, of the people of Babylon, he lived in the city of the Chaldeans, Babylon, after the flood, in the time of Nibu-Rizbani, who was the first to build the city of Babylon after Nimrod, son of Cush. He was skilled in the knowledge of medicine and philosophy, knew the natures of numbers, and his student was Pythagoras, the arithmetician. This Hermes renewed the knowledge of medicine, philosophy, mathematics that was lost during the flood at Babylon. That is what al-Mubassir stated. The city of the Chaldeans was the city of the philosophers of the people of the East. Their philosophers were the first to make definitions and to organize laws. They were the philosophers of the Persian sages. The third Hermes. He lived in the city of Egypt. He was after the flood. He is the author of Poisonous Animals. He was a philosopher and a physician, knowledgeable in the natures of lethal drugs and infectious animals. He traveled around in different countries, wandering in them, knowing the foundations of cities, their natures, and the natures of their peoples. He is the author of a valuable discourse on the art of alchemy. Part of it is related to crafts like glass, stringing precious stones, implements of clay, and such things. He had a student who is known, whose name was Asclepius. There are absurd reports and many stories about him. We will seek to procure the ones that are true from what is available in well-known books. Since this account of the three Hermeses was so influential, we have to ask, where does al-Mubassir get this idea from? There is an account of the two Hermeses, or of two Hermeses, in the Hermetic tract, the Asclepius, in which Hermes says to Asclepius, his disciple, take your ancestor, for example. He was the first to discover medicine, Asclepius. They dedicated a temple to him on the Libyan mountain near the shores of the crocodiles. Even now, he still provides help to sick people by his divine power, as he used to offer it through the art of medicine. And Hermes, whose family name I bear, does not he dwell in his native city that was named for him, where mortals come from all around for his aid and protection? So here Hermes distinguished between his student Asclepius and his student's ancestor, Asclepius the god of healing, and similarly distinguished between himself and Hermes the god worshipped at Hermopolis. But can we find an account of multiple Hermeses that could have influenced al-Mubassir's account? The trail begins with George Syncellus, who wrote a world chronicle in Constantinople around 808 to 810, citing earlier chronicles that are now lost. In particular, he cites the Book of Sothis, said to be authored by the Egyptian priest Manetho. And this is supposed to be Manetho here. It's a sculpture of a priest of Serapis, and Manetho was said to be a priest of Serapis, so this is about the closest we can do. There's a debate about whether Manetho existed at all, but everyone agrees that the Book of Sothis, which we only know from this citation from Syncellus, was not written by Manetho, even if Manetho really did exist. Syncellus writes, now it remains to treat small passages from the writings of Manetho of Sibonitos concerning the dynasty of the Egyptians. In the time of Ptolemy Philadelphos, he was serving as a high priest of the temples and idols of Egypt, and on the basis of monuments lying in the Syriatic land that were inscribed, as he says, in a sacred language and priestly characters by Thoth, the first Hermes, and translated after the flood from the sacred characters into Greek with hieroglyphic characters, and committed to books by the second Hermes, Agathodaimon's son, father of Tot, in the shrines of the holy places of Egypt. And Syncellus continues with Manetho's promise to King Ptolemy to produce for him the sacred books of his forefather, Hermes thrice greatest. This account of the first Hermes preserving knowledge before the flood, and the second Hermes restoring that knowledge after the flood, is too similar to the account of al-Mubassir's to be coincidence. But how are they connected? Syncellus was one participant in a current of Christian chronicles. These are the remains of some part of an Alexandrian Christian chronicle, somewhat restored. These were attempts to show the truth of Christianity by the accuracy and antiquity of its knowledge of historic dates. The Christian chroniclers had a problem with Egyptian and Babylonian accounts that seemed to show detailed knowledge of dynasties for thousands of years before the flood. So Syncellus quoted Manetho's account in order to refute it in later passages of his work. Syncellus's source for Manetho's story is an Alexandrian Christian chronicler named Panodorus from around the year 400. Contemporary with Panodorus, there was an Alexandrian Christian chronicler named Anianus, who would also have included the story of Manetho in his own work. And while there is no reason to believe that al-Mubassir knew about Syncellus or Panodorus, it can be shown that al-Mubassir was familiar with the works of Anianus. From this, we can deduce the likelihood that al-Mubassir's story of the first two Hermeses is derived from Anianus citing the Book of Sothis, supposedly by Manetho, the Egyptian priest. And by the way, it is possible that the identification of Hermes with Enoch may have first occurred in one of these Alexandrian Christian chronicles or one of their successors. The Islamic identification of Enoch and Idris goes back at least to Wahb ibn Munabi, who died around 730, a second-generation Muslim who said that Idris is Enoch and that God had given Idris 30 scrolls. This is reminiscent of the books of Enoch, as we covered in an earlier class. So we've accounted for the first two Hermeses, but what about the third? It turns out that there is a separate testimony as to the text of al-Mubassir from the 14th century poet Ibn Nubata that, although originating from a later date, includes passages not otherwise known. One of those passages shows that the description of the third Hermes comes from al-Kindi, who, as we've seen, had access to a Hermetic treatise in Arabic now lost to us, and besides, probably knew some of the Haranians who had emigrated to Baghdad and might have shared their traditions regarding the life of Hermes. These conflicting biographies of Hermes, along with the title Trismegistos, or triplicate in wisdom, greatness, and so forth, might have encouraged al-Mubassir to compile them as three separate individuals. The Islamic prophet named Idris is originally known through the Quran, especially Surah 19, 56 and 57, and mention Idris in the book. He was true, a prophet. We raised him to a high place. In Genesis, it is said that God took Enoch. The books of Enoch, which were translated into many languages and widely read, describe Enoch as a prophet who was raised to heaven and shown the shape of the cosmos, the past, and the future. In the first book of Enoch, chapter 14 shows how Enoch was taken up to heaven to behold the house of God, surrounded by angels. Chapter 71 tells how he was shown all the secrets of the ends of the heavens, the storehouses of all the stars and the luminaries, and how they proceed. Chapters 72 to 82 has him receiving astronomical knowledge from Uriel. In the second book of Enoch, he ascends the seven heavens one by one. And as we've seen, Muslims identified Idris with Enoch early on. So when Hermes was identified with Idris, then Hermes became the subject of the stories of the heavenly ascent that were originally proper to Enoch. This is where the Ismailis come in. As we discussed last time, Shia Muslims organized around the leadership of a succession of imams. Eventually, there were disputes about that succession. One group believed that the succession passed through the descendants of Muhammad ibn Ismail, and they became known as the Ismailis. To begin with, they sent out missionaries known as da'is from their concealed base in Syria. Two of these da'is, sometime around 875 to 899, one in North Africa and the other in northern Iran, used the figure of Hermes in identical ways to argue that the principles of true philosophy and science are part of divine revelation, and that human reason can tinker with these revelations but cannot surpass them. Hermes is thus given as a prophet of science. In this context, they both mention, both of the da'is mentioned the Sur al-Haliqa, composed around 813 to 833, passages of which were included in the suggested readings for those of you who picked those up. The first tells the tale of how Belinus, otherwise known as Apollonius of Tyana, comes to discover the Emerald Tablet. And the second is the earliest known version of the Emerald Tablet itself, a bit different from the Latin translation from the 12th century, but still unmistakable. Oh, I'm going to have to, I see, look over to the side in order to read about this. Could have thought this through more. So this is a version of the earliest known Arabic Emerald Tablet. And I think it's a particularly useful translation of it. It contains an accurate commentary that can't be doubted. So we are accepting this as a divine revelation and turning off the doubting mind. It states, what is the above is from the below, and the below is from the above. The work of wonders is from one. So the one being, the one consciousness is the source of all dichotomies, the above, the below, the light, the dark, the left, the right. And this entire play of manifestation that we know as life and existence is from the one. And all things sprang from this essence through a single projection. How marvelous is its work! It is the principal part of the world and its custodian. So all things come from the single one work, the single projection of the one. And the one remains the foremost part of existence, and it is also its custodian. It remains engaged with the creation. It is no remote creator, but is thoroughly in and with all things. Its father is the sun, and its mother is the moon. Thus the wind bore it within it, and the earth nourished it. So not only is the one the source of the four elements, but it co-emerges. All things, all multiple things, co-arise with the one, such that it can seem as if the elements are what nurtures and allows the one to be. So there's a reciprocal, spontaneous co-arising. And this is also the root of the elements itself. And we can also see that this is very similar to passages found in the Greek magical papyri. So there's some kind of literary lineage going on here. Father of talismans and keeper of wonders. So if you are a magician and you want to do wonder works, if you want to make talismans, it isn't you that does it. It is the one working through you that is the source for all such wonders. Perfect in power that reveals the lights. So all that can be seen, all the lights, originates as a manifestation of consciousness, but is not a passive consciousness, but is a power, a perfect power. It is a fire that became our earth. Separate the earth from the fire, and you shall adhere more to that which is subtle than that which is coarse, through care and wisdom. So it is a light that becomes matter. And should you make the distinction between what is matter and what is light, what is consciousness, you will find that you will identify more deeply with that consciousness than with that matter through which you are embodied, if you are proceeding with this carefully and with attention. It ascends from the earth to the heaven. It extracts the lights from the heights and descends to the earth, containing the power of the above and the below, for it is with the light of the lights. Therefore, darkness flees from it. So once embodied, it is natural that we seek the heights, that we evolve, that we return to the understanding of our own nature as the one. And when we do, it extracts the lights. It brings that knowledge and understanding and descends to the earth, continuing into our embodiment, containing the power of the above and below, because now we recognize ourselves as the simultaneous identity of matter and consciousness. For we are with the light of lights, the source of sources. And you can note that this light of lights is a term that we find in Suhrawardi, as we discussed in Islamic Neoplatonism. So there could possibly be a lineage connection here too. And with that understanding of our identity as embodied consciousness, the darkness, the obscurations of discovering that, something manifesting as if it is not us, as if it is beyond our power, flees from us. The greatest power overcomes everything that is subtle, and it penetrates all that is coarse. So from that position of unity, we are able to see into, to understand, to be with and identify with the subtlest manifestations of light, of awareness, of energy, as well as the deepest and coarsest parts of raw matter. The formation of the microcosm is in accordance with the formation of the macrocosm. And so the structures that we find of the created world emanate from the structures at the most subtle levels. So this is a core characteristic of emanationist philosophy in general. The scholars made this their path, the philosophers. So the philosophers are philosophers because they had this understanding and did this work. This is why thrice Hermes was exalted with wisdom, because Hermes not only did this work, but he was the one who communicated this work. And this is the last book that he hid in the catacomb. So we see that there was the story of how Balinus found was instructed to find the tablet, and that this is the very same tablet that appears in that opening instruction. The implication of the Sur al-Haliqa is that natural science is revealed knowledge, specifically revealed knowledge from Hermes Idris. Perhaps Ismaili missionaries were distributing the Sur al-Haliqa and its concepts throughout their ministries at this time. And at the least, some Muslims at this time fully regarded Hermes as a prophet, so that the Hermetica, the astrological works in particular, were revealed knowledge on a par with any other true prophet. And it helped that by this time, Hermes was already identified as the prophet of the Sabians. Hermes had already been known as an authority on astrology from writings in Persian and Arabic. Once the idea of Hermes' heavenly ascent became established, it was understood that the ascent was the means by which he discovered astrology. One interesting and widespread example of this is the Arabic Book of the Apple, also known from its Latin translation as Liber de Pomo. This is modeled after Plato's Phaedo, and this painting is about Plato's Phaedo rather than the Book of the Apple. It is a dialogue between a dying sage and his disciples on the afterlife and the fear of death. Now, we know that an Arabic version of the Phaedo itself existed in the 9th century, and al-Kindi wrote a work that seems to have been related to the Phaedo, so the resemblance of the Book of the Apple to the Phaedo isn't a coincidence. In some versions of the Book of the Apple, the sage is Socrates, but in most, and probably the earliest versions, it's actually Aristotle. And here's a passage. Diogenes, whence did the philosophers arrive at this view? The sage answered, the preachers of the ages have always preached this up to the horizons of the earth. The first of the people of our land to whom this science was revealed was Hermes. Diogenes asked, whence did it come to Hermes? The sage answered, he ascended in his spirit into heaven and heard it from the heavenly host of angels who took it from the noble record. Then he returned to earth and the sages learned it from him. Diogenes said, how do I know that he took it from the inhabitants of heaven? The sage answered, if this matter is the truth, then its advent was on high. So you can see, even though this is supposed to be a dialogue with Aristotle, the story actually sounds very much like the first book of Enoch. In the end, the sage recommends a list of books, starting with the book of first principles called the Book of Hermes. And this might be the Sur al-Haliqa, or at least there is a passage in the Book of the Apple that is very similar to this Sur al-Haliqa. And as we've seen, a similar transmission from Hermes to Aristotle is assumed in the talismanic Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. The authorship of the Book of the Apple is unknown, but there is reason to think that it has to do with the Ismailis. There's a passage in the Rasa'il of the Ikhwan al-Safa, or Brethren of Purity. It is related about Hermes, the triplicate in wisdom, who is Idris, the prophet, peace be upon him, that he rose to the sphere of Saturn and turned together with it for 30 years, until he witnessed all the states of the heavenly sphere. Then he descended to the earth and informed the people of the sciences of astrology. God said, we raised him to a high place. Now note the reference to the sphere of Saturn, which is the outermost planetary sphere in the Ptolemaic model, and 30 years, which was the accepted approximation of Saturn's orbital period. Another work attributed to Hermes of Dendera is known as the Great Treatise of the Spheres, and has this to say. Hermes said, for the one whose services to the highest light is lasting, things go as he wishes. I am the master of wonders who ascended the 7 celestial spheres. I mastered the brilliant sun and the illuminating moon. I planted the luminous tree of wisdom. Whoever eats the fruit of which does not hunger and needs no food and drink. He becomes spiritual, divine, has inexhaustible knowledge and unceasing good. I am the one who constructed the Egyptian temple and filled it with divine wisdom and erected in it the image of Rtumus, endowed with 4 faces that indicate with their signs what happens in the 4 directions of the world. The end of the text explains that it was rediscovered in the tunnels beneath the temple at Dendera under the image of Rtumus. There are indeed tunnels beneath the temple at Dendera, along with a pillar of the 4 faces of Hathor, as we see on the left. So some have supposed that Rtumus is meant to be Artemis, thought to be equivalent to Hathor. The Temple of Dendera is covered with hieroglyphs and contains the famous mural of the zodiac seen on the right, so it might have been natural for a visitor at that time to believe that this was the site of the inscription of Hermes. Arabic philosophers, starting with al-Kindi, held that the soul could undergo heavenly ascent when purified. And in our Islamic Neoplatonism class, we saw this with al-Farabi and Avicenna. This idea is also found in the golden verses of Pythagoras, which were known in Arabic. Then, if you leave the body behind and go to the free ether, you will be immortal, an undying God, no longer mortal. And of course, there's also the famous Plotinus passage about leaving the body, which was well known from the Arabic theology of Aristotle. Al-Mubassir ibn Fatik, actually supposed to be a picture of him, in 1048, wrote an important text about Hermes. It's a book of wise sayings, along with the biographies of those who said them. The first 4 biographies are those of Seth, Hermes, Tat, and Asclepius. It says that Seth is the first Urani, an unknown meaning, a title with an unknown meaning. One interpretation of Urani is luminous. Seth is the first Urani, Agathodimon the second, and Hermes the third. This account of Hermes is distinct from that of Abu Masar, but all major Arabic historians of philosophy of the 13th century mixed Abu Masar and al-Mubassir's accounts. Al-Mubassir's compendium was translated into Spanish, Latin, French, Provençal, and English, and so was popular in Europe. It describes a single Hermes who founded a religion described in very similar terms to what al-Kindi said of the religion of Haran. In that same account of al-Kindi, the luminaries of Haran are said to be Urani, Agathodimon, and Hermes, so the word Urani is certainly connected to Haran. The religious laws of Hermes are also described by al-Mubassir in similar terms to al-Kindi. Hermes is said to have been raised to heaven at the age of 82. He was not sent back to Earth, nor did he return with any sciences, so this might be from a source earlier than accounts to the contrary. Some of this account is similar to that of the third Hermes originating with al-Kindi. It is likely that al-Mubassir and al-Kindi's accounts stem from a common source. In the conclusion, the text says that the religion of Hermes is the Hanifi community. Hanifi means pagan, but by this time it is a word with positive connotations in Haran and among Muslims, as in the virtuous pagans of whom Abraham was a member, so that Haranians could claim that theirs was the religion of Abraham, and Abraham had settled in Haran. This conclusion is therefore likely to have been of Haranian origin. The religion of Hermes and the Hanifi community is said to have been Din al-Qayyima, the upright religion, as in the Quran Surah 98:5. They were not commanded but to worship God, devoting religion entirely to Him as Hanifs, and to perform the prayer and to give the alms. That is the upright religion. Al-Mubassir's source is clearly saying that the religion of Hermes is that of the true monotheist pagans who are saved, not the polytheists destined for hell. A version of this text circulated in a Latin translation of the Spanish under the name Liber Philosophorum Moralium Antiquorum. For the purposes of upcoming classes, if you take away only one thing, it should be the following. It is likely that al-Mubassir's account was known to Italian scholars of the late 15th century, such as Marsilio Ficino. This description of Hermes' teachings testified that Hermes was an antediluvian sage and teacher of holy rituals regulated astrologically. So this is what sets the stage for the conception of Hermes just prior to the Hermetic revival in Europe. Incidentally, the English translation of al-Mubassir, called Dictes and Sayings of the Philosophers, was the first book with an imprint date printed in England by William Caxton. I just wanted to give a shout out to all you fans of Renaissance typography out there. The maxims or wise sayings of Hermes are a significant portion of the Arabic Hermetica, and particularly popular in the Arabic-speaking world. Over 200 such maxims are known. A few can be traced back to a Greek source. At least one, probably more of the maxims in al-Mubassir, can be traced to Sanskrit, maxims of the ancient sage Chanakya. Also, al-Mubassir is Also in al-Mubassir is a section of teachings from Hermes to King Ammon that depicts the teachings as very similar to Islam. Internal evidence of the text leads the author of the Arabic Hermes, Van Bladel, to believe that its original source is a Haranian Sabian, most likely one in Baghdad. The 12th century historian and philosopher al-Shahrastani who some believe to have been an Ismaili, wrote a refutation of the Sabians, citing Hermes against them. In this connection, I'd like to recommend an essay by Henry Corbin, Sabian Temple and Ismailianism, collected in his book, Temple and Contemplation. In our class on Islamic Neoplatonism, we went into detail on the medieval Islamic doctrine of the active intellect, and this naturally entwined with the ongoing interest in Hermeticism. The 12th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Baga held that Aristotle and Hermes were somehow together through their contact with the active intellect, a bit like how Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi can float together in the Force after their deaths. Around this time, there also first appeared the one existent Arabic Hermetic treatise that can be described as philosophical rather than technical, the Kitab fi Zajr an-Nafs, or Rebuke of the Soul. It is a dialogue between Hermes and the soul, in which he exhorts the soul to virtue. It is not, to my taste, riveting reading, but it was extraordinarily popular in the Arabic world for centuries. There are several other interesting manifestations of Hermes in the 12th and 13th centuries, but the underlying point is that by this time, the status of Hermes as a prophet was widely recognized by Muslims. We earlier spoke about Shahab al-Din Yahya al-Surawardi, who regarded Hermes as one of his most important forebears, particularly because of the doctrine of perfect nature, which we touched on before. But now we can look into where Surawardi got the idea, which takes us back to the Gayat al-Hakim, particularly the section preceding the planetary magic treatise we discussed earlier. It makes no mention of Sabians as such, but it is supremely Hermetic and is said to be derived from the talismanic Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetic text, Kitab al-Istimachis. It is a ritual for calling forth one's perfect nature. It begins with a story about Hermes encountering his perfect nature that recalls both the story of Belinus in the Sur al-Haliqa and the story of Hermes and Poimandres in the first tract of the Corpus Hermetica. Perfect nature in this case instructs in how it can be called, when the moon goes into Aries, with a table in the east on which were arranged 4 bowls of certain oils, 4 bowls of alcohol, and in the midst a glass vessel containing a candle and candies made from walnut oil, butter, and sugar. There are magical words to be repeated and an invocation, and perfect nature appears. It is mentioned that the philosophers did this once or twice a year. And the implication here is that this method that Hermes used to call forth his perfect nature, transmitted by Aristotle, is the wisdom that allowed Alexander to become king of the world. It includes this advice. When you first start to look inside of yourself, to your managing spirit that connects you with your star, and that is the perfect nature that Hermes the Wise mentioned in his book, saying that the microcosm, in which he meant the human, if he was perfected in his nature, his soul would be in the position of the stationary sun in the sky, that shines with its light on the whole world. So as the perfect nature, it spreads in the soul, so its rays connect with the power of wisdom, and pulls it till it is centered in the soul, that is originally its place, like exactly the sun pulls the rays of the world and lifts it up in the sky. There is nothing else in the Gayat al-Hakim anything like this, which inclines me to believe that all of the other spells and talismans and so forth in the book are really secondary, and that it is this particular knowledge that is itself the goal of the wise, for which the book is named. And that brings us to the end of our exploration of Arabic Hermeticism. I hope you'll join us next time, 7 p.m., Wednesday, October 7th, because we're going to have a special guest lecturer, my friend Stian Kulistan, talk with us on the subject of grimoires, a field that has seen tremendous historical breakthroughs in recent years, about which I know almost nothing. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you all are too.